Well, good morning, everyone. My name is William Kilbride, and I work for an organisation called the Digital Preservation Coalition. And it's my pleasure to speak to you today from my salubrious office here at the University of Glasgow. Let me start with an apology that I'm not able to join you in person. I had hoped I could have been with you today in Melbourne. Unfortunately, the time and the distance is too great for a relatively short presentation. I should apologise that I have small children. The travel at this particular time of year is especially challenging. But I do hope that at some point in the future I may indeed be able to come and join you all face to face. I also wish I could be with you because I think the programme which has been put together for today's workshop looks particularly interesting, making the case for digital preservations among galleries, among libraries, archives and museums. A particularly hard job. We focus a great deal, I think, in digital preservation around matters of technology, on collections management, on metadata, on storage. But actually what we've learned over the years is that making the case for digital preservation is an ongoing requirement. And indeed, the constantly emerging changes in technology lead to a constantly emerging need for some constant degree of advocacy. Now, the organisation I work for, the Digital Preservation Coalition, is fundamentally founded for the purposes of awareness raising and advocacy, and it's my pleasure to share with you some small parts of our learning, some small parts of our experience, which I hope you'll find useful. I've framed it as a presentation around the triple bottom line and how digital preservation measures up against that concept of the triple bottom line. Something you might find useful to take to your managers, to your executives, to senior people in your organisations. I'll come back at the end of the presentation. You'll see my contact details at the start, at the end. Quite delighted to get back into conversation with you by whatever means is most appropriate, by email, by Twitter, whatever might work for you, and to make this a dialogue. Although I'm not with you in person, we have all the means, we have all the tools, we have all the technologies that allow us to continue the dialogue now and for the medium to long term. So my presentation is not simply some notes around advocacy, although that's important. It's also an invitation to continue that dialogue for the long term. In this short presentation, I'm going to be talking about the nature of the digital preservation challenge and methods, some ideas for how to make the case for investment in digital materials for the long term. Let's start with what we know. Paper collections, paper records, physical collections are fairly well understood. They're quite robust, they're tangible, we can hold them in our hands. We know simply by sometimes the smell when there is an issue with rot. And generally the records are independently understandable, that is, if you understand the language in which they are written. Moreover, the library and archive and museum community is quite experienced at assigning value to our physical collections. We can insure them for explicit sums of money, and if necessary, we can buy them and sell them and raise a mortgage against them. That's not the case with digital information. Digital objects are ephemeral by nature. They are susceptible to a variety of types of obsolescence, such as obsolescence of media or media degradation, the formats in which information is wrapped, the documentation associated with the objects necessary to make them useful to us can get lost or can become separated from the objects. And we face complicated and integrated challenges associated with rights. Copyright, not simply in terms of the content of an object, but potentially also around the formats and wrappers and software necessary to render them. Not to mention the moral rights or the information security challenges and data protection challenges that large quantities of data throw up. Broadly speaking, we recognise that where we are skilled in the management of physical collections, so we need new skills and new solutions to the long-term management of digital information. And if we can achieve that, we can release new kinds of benefits, new types of access, new types of reuse and repurposing of this digital content, all of which is for the good. So what's the problem? Now, typically in the context of digital preservation, we start our digital preservation discussions around data loss. the digital dark age, the digital black hole. There's not a good metaphor in this space at all. Let's start that conversation in perhaps a slightly different place and end with a slightly different conclusion, therefore. Let's observe that digital documents, digital data, digital files, they have some sort of value to us. That value is in the real world. It creates real world opportunities for access, for information sharing, and for cultural enjoyment, for organisational transparency, whatever the context might be. That value, however, depends on access, and access depends on software and hardware and people. And software and hardware and people have a habit of changing. We're not going ever to be in a position where we can stop that change in technology and hardware and people. And consequently, our investment in technology can create barriers to reuse. Those barriers to reuse sometimes mean data loss, but actually the real problem is that managing data in the long term means managing opportunities in the long term. Loss of data means loss of real-world opportunities. It's an important observation. We're going to come back to this later. Let's first of all stop for a moment and think of what our experience has been around digital preservation. So I'm going to be speaking for something in the region of 30 minutes. I think it's going to be really useful, however, for you to spend time speaking to each other, developing not only digital preservation skills, but that vital component in digital preservation, your own personal network. So let's stop for 2 minutes and talk to the person next to you, especially if that person's from a different organisation from your own. What brought you here today? What data really matters to you? How long do you need to keep that data, and what format is it presented to you in? What media do you use to store that information, and what documentation, if any, do you need for that information to be useful? Hopefully you found that session and discussion useful. Let's turn our attention now to some challenges and some solutions that have presented themselves from the digital preservation community. Let's start with the obvious comment that digital preservation seems expensive and it's difficult to know where to start. We're going to turn in a moment in more detail to that question of cost and how to get started, but it's worth noting that there's lots and lots of help in the context of digital preservation, not simply on how to do digital preservation, but also how to build a business case and tools to aid with preservation planning. In fact, there's almost too much advice. In some sense, and over the last 10 years or so in digital preservation, we've taken a complex issue and overwhelmed it with acronyms and services and tools. And that can somehow seem overwhelming. A useful place to start, therefore, a solid foundation, I would always recommend the Digital Preservation Handbook. I'm not sure how many of you will have come across this recently. However, it was published, republished, revised and updated in 2016. It's freely available and it aims to provide a comprehensive guide to the challenges of digital preservation with appropriate commentary and appropriate pointers to more detailed advice where that may be necessary. So let me strongly recommend you have a look at the Digital Preservation Handbook, written by a college of experts, a college of peers and practitioners, and designed entirely to be readable by those who might feel otherwise intimidated by the technology and by the sophisticated tools and services which have emerged over the last 10 years. A second challenge relates to the topic of obsolescence. This is a warning for snake oil salesmen who may come into your office or may come into your organisation and say that they have a specific product that will take away all your digital preservation cares. Be aware that digital preservation systems need to be complex because they're subject to the same obsolescence as the objects that they safeguard. That's to say, there will never be a single point in time solution to digital preservation. The systems that we develop need to be able to respond to the obsolescence which challenges the objects that we're there to look after in the first place. That means systems need to be designed which are resilient, which are modular insofar as small components can be removed and replaced when they no longer serve their purpose. And for that to work, they need to be based on standards and need to be tested on an ongoing basis. This is the point in our presentation where we move into a brief discussion of the standards around digital preservation. And I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't start with a mention of the Open Archival Information System Standard, OAIS. It's one of the keystones of digital preservation, and in particular, it provides much of the terminology you're going to find in the field. This diagram represents the functional model, at least a simplified version of the functional model of the Open Archival Information System. The OAIS presents three models of the world, one of them describing the various functions that have to exist within a long-term digital archive. What you can see here are a series of items which are presented into the archive by producers. Those are called the submission information packages. They are transformed into archival information packages, AIP, and are served up to consumers as dissemination information packages. It all sounds fairly straightforward. One might ask, what could possibly go wrong? But it does, when broken down, start becoming rather complicated. So each of the functional areas of OAIS in turn breaks down to a series of sub-functional or functional components. And those functional components are themselves subject to significant amounts of description and disagreement in the literature. Overlying the functional model of OAIS, and perhaps more important, is the information model within OAIS. And the information model shows you how to assemble the archival information package and how that's brought together from a range of different sources. Key concept here being representation information, which sits more or less at the middle of the diagram, the information necessary to allow a digital object to be interpreted. And of course, for a digital object to be interpreted, it in turn needs some understanding of who's doing that interpretation, introducing a further concept or component, which is the designated community. It's very easy to get overwhelmed with the diagrams, with the modules, with the structures, with the standards in digital preservation. But it is equally important to ensure that any systems that we purchase or any tools that we buy are themselves responsive to those standards and to those processes. Let's turn our attention to a third challenge. Access and long-term use depends on a constant configuration of hardware, software, and data and the capacity of the operator, as previously mentioned. This actually means we need to capture information. It effectively means that digital preservation, in many senses, resolves back to a documentation challenge, a metadata challenge, to give it another phrase. How can we capture sufficient documentation to ensure that that constant configuration is understood? And more importantly, perhaps not how do we simply capture it, how do we package it so that that metadata, so that that documentation can be reused. And so a number of tools and standards have emerged which are designed to capture sufficient documentation in order that digital objects can be rendered useful through time. In particular, I'm thinking here about a metadata standard called Premise. Premise offers a data dictionary for wrapping the necessary information to ensure that a digital object can be made coherent and sensible through time. Allied to Premise, a second set of tools around METs allow for the Premise descriptive information to be wrapped alongside the originating digital object. So the metadata encoding and transmission standard METs is a useful tool alongside Premise to capture the information necessary for a digital object to be useful. There are a number of automated tools as well which will support that process. I'm thinking here in particular about characterization tools, and there are several characterization tools available. At the top of the list, a tool called Pronom and Droid, which sit together from the National Archives in the UK. Pronom is the world's largest and most useful database of file format signatures. Droid is a little tool which will search through a network and identify where those file format signatures exist. And consequently, Pronom and Droid work together to ensure that one can have a sensible characterization of an entire digital collection. That all forms part of a useful set of tools around a collections audit. in which one might have clear procedures for managing and documenting information. Let's think about the nature of the obsolescence challenge. Technology continues to change, and that creates the conditions for obsolescence. Consequently, we need to plan and take actions expecting that our current plans need to change. So we recognise digital preservation not as a one-off point in time fix. We recognise it, in fact, as an ongoing commitment. An ongoing commitment not simply to the data, but an ongoing commitment to understanding the nature of the technological developments which are pushing forward our successive generations of information technology. So any organisation which picks up the digital preservation challenge is in effect taking up the challenge of being, to some extent, a learning institution that is committed to constantly monitoring technology. What I'm saying here is that digital preservation is an active process, and what we need is active preservation. We need to be constantly planning and testing whether our planning is effective. It's not sufficient to put material on one storage medium. We need to have an active plan whereby those storage media are replaced through time, or at least monitored through time. And there are multiple different approaches to how one would implement such a preservation plan. Let's pause for a moment and pick these up. Their most popular approach to digital preservation is migration. Migration in this context means moving information from one file format to another, effectively unwrapping the information and then wrapping it up again in a new format. A simple example of that might be to take a file out of an early version of PDF and put it into a more recent version of PDF. It might be that one takes a sensible decision to put it into what one might consider a robust version of that file format. So taking it out of a PDF, early version PDF 1.1, and wrapping it up as a PDF A, which is a specifically designed archival version of the PDF format. And you might see opportunities or you might see risks associated with particular types of commercial and proprietary software. So for example, in the context of CAD, one might have many files presented to you in formats associated with AutoCAD or with Autodesk, the company behind AutoCAD, but you might spot that AutoCAD and Autodesk have a habit of deprecating their file formats, and consequently there might be some merit in moving things out of a version of Autodesk or AutoCAD formats into a generic, accessible, non-proprietary standard. Migration from one file format to another has been certainly the most widely adopted digital preservation strategy because it has the lowest barriers to implement. But it's not the only solution, and nor is it the solution for every context. A second approach, emulation, allows you to ensure that a program can be emulated as if it was performing or operating on original hardware or software. And why might one want to do that? Well, a migration approach works very well in the context where it's the informational content that needs to be moved from one generation to the next. But it's less effective if one wants to move the entire environment. And some types of digital object, of course, have no data specifically behind them. So one might want quite reasonably to move a piece of software from one generation to the next, or to test a piece of software to see how it would have performed in particular conditions at a particular point in time. Computer games industry in particular has made emulation its own. Migration has been the most popularly adopted solution, but emulation these days seems to have much more available on offer, because of course an emulation tool will also allow you to provide access to the data, as well as to understand how the operators might have entered the information in any particular way using the tools and programs available to them. Moreover, in the context of cloud computing, emulation becomes available as a service, overcoming the distribution problems which bedeviled early versions of emulation. A third approach, might be described as the hardware preservation approach, means trying to store up in a back cupboard somewhere all of those old versions of hardware and software that one might possibly ever have accumulated. If I was in the room, I would now be asking for a show of hands of anyone who had a cupboard somewhere at home or in their office where for some reason undisclosed they are accumulating old hardware, potentially also old software manuals, in the faint hope that these might become useful to you at some point in the future. Let me observe that hardware preservation is very difficult to do, and it's very expensive, and it's difficult and expensive to do simply for the reason that one needs to be able to acquire spare parts. If you want to get old hardware to work, one needs to be able to replace components within that old hardware when they wear out, and that might mean fabricating quite complicated components to the internals of your computing equipment. Fabricating a single chip could cost billions and billions of pounds in terms of creating the fabrication plant necessary to generate it. So, except under very unusual circumstances, hardware preservation is not a widely adopted approach. It's worth noting, however, that as digital preservation continues to evolve, so new approaches continue to emerge. And one thinks, for example, of the implications of virtualization, previously mentioned cloud computing in the context of emulation, which effectively overcomes some of the distribution challenges which had previously bedeviled earlier approaches to digital preservation. If one can simply use a virtual machine to generate any old computing environment, then suddenly many of the challenges associated with emulation and possibly even migration fall away. It certainly introduces an economy of scale and an economy of scope which was previously not available to us. In any case, the point is that digital preservation is an active process, and if we're going to make a commitment to the long term, we need to be engaging with new strategies, new plans on an ongoing basis. It's very easy at this point to start thinking you're making an open-ended commitment to something which looks awfully complicated. So I feel it's important to say out loud at this point, keep calm. Let's not panic about this. We don't need, in fact, to understand or do all of this to achieve good results in digital preservation. And even if we did, it doesn't all need to exist in the same form at the same time. Some of the organisations I speak to, candidly, they need to hear the following message. Don't keep your backups on the floor of the server room. And if you move your backups from the floor of the server room, you've made a simple step forward in digital preservation. Let's take the appropriate steps for our organisation. So let's pause again for a couple of minutes. I've been speaking around a range of different tools and techniques, and I want to get you the opportunities to speak to each other again. What's worked for you, if anything? What's not worked for you? Why has it not worked? What barriers have you faced in implementing a digital preservation solution? Where did you start, or where might you start if you had the opportunity to do so? I'm going to take the presentation in a slightly different direction now, which is to ask how to persuade people, especially how to persuade your boss, to pay attention to the digital preservation challenge. And this is in particular the invitation which I received when we were putting the programme together for this session, advocacy for digital preservation being one of the key issues which organisations face. I'm going to answer this question in a slightly eccentric way, but hopefully you'll see the value of the answer in a moment when we get there. And I'm going to start by observing that everything I've said before around digital preservation is, while true, it's worth observing, as David Rosenthal has pointed out, that we could have all the technology and all the clever solutions in the world, but money turns out to be a major problem facing the future of digital heritage. We can think of the solutions, but unless we're in a position to persuade our managers to invest in those solutions, then we're going to struggle for the long term. Thinking, therefore, about money leads me to think around the idea of the bottom line. So what is the digital preservation bottom line? In financial terms, we can identify the bottom line, but let's not just think purely in financial terms. And I want to introduce perhaps a familiar concept, the idea of the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line is a planning concept which is widely used in accountancy practice to allow organisations to measure their success not simply in financial terms, but also in terms of the environmental and social impact that their work, that their outputs, that their operations have. So one can be financially very robust, but to be, a hated company. One would rather be financially less robust, but also potentially not so hated. And that's what the triple bottom line tries to reach towards. Can we talk about digital preservation through these three perspectives of environment, society, and finance? Let's start with the finance question. Digital preservation has focused quite a lot of effort actually on costs and benefits. There's been a great focus on costs. There's been any number of cost models, for example, in digital preservation. We ask the question, is digital preservation expensive? Well, it depends how you view that. By and large, no is the answer. However, it's typically an unfunded mandate. It's something else we need to do, and something else we need to do on top of all the other things we need to do, and it's something which we're not explicitly funded to do, so that makes it seem expensive. It seems extra expensive when not only do we need to do this additional work, but we need to spend quite a lot of capital in order to get to a place where it's affordable. We need to spend money up front, capital money, and once we've spent that, one would hope that the ongoing revenue costs are less. Digital preservation seems expensive if we're constantly asking for capital and we don't properly have a mandate to understand what it is we do. I don't want to focus purely on cost. Let's focus a little more on value. And I'm going to come to an example of that in a moment. But it's worth asking, do you know the value? Can you put a financial value on the data that you manage? And I'm guessing here, but I'm going to posit that lots of people in the room might be able to come up with a financial value for a library collection or an archive collection or a museum collection based on insurance valuation or purchase price at auction. But very few of us can put an insurance valuation on our data. And that's a problem when we try to express digital objects in financial terms. Let's think in terms of benefits. Can we identify a return on investment? Well, yes, and we'll see why in a moment. But let's remember that those benefits are typically deferred, so the benefits come in the future. The benefits are free riders. The people who derive the benefit aren't necessarily the people that have to pay the cost. That makes a sort of problematic misalignment between the people who have to pay the money and the people who benefit from that expenditure. Let's also think about the economic impact of data. We can sometimes struggle to see the specific value of a data set, but we can see the economic impact of its reuse in a variety of different models. Let's remember fundamentally the issues around data storage. So David Rosenthal again talks to us about the impending storage cost crisis. Here's three figures to take home with you. Data creation. Our ability to create data is expanding at around 60% per annum. Our capacity to store data is expanding at something in the region of 40% per annum. One can quickly see that those two figures alone are by definition unsustainable. It means we're going to have to lose some data. The question is whether we lose that data by coincidence or whether we lose it through a managed process of deduplication and appraisal. The first two numbers are instructive. The third number I think is perhaps the most important. IT budgets are not keeping pace with our ability to create data. They're not even close to keeping pace with our ability to create data. Even in a benign environment, if IT budgets are increasing at 2 or 3% per annum, we still have a significant sustainability issue for the long-term management of digital content. You might observe that digital preservation, therefore, by expecting us to keep large quantities of data, creates a crisis or extends that crisis. But actually, my observation would be that digital preservation is subtly about choosing the things that we want to retain and identifying those things which can be managed through risk and which can be disposed of. And if we're managing disposal, we're going to be in a much better place when it comes to this impending storage cost crisis. So digital preservation strategy is your way to work through that cost crisis. Let's think of the value of data. I'm going to do this from a first-person singular perspective. I have in my life been involved in the creation of two repositories. One digital repository, the Archaeology Data Service at the University of York, and one physical repository, the Glasgow Museum's Resources Centre. Let's remember that archaeology is a risk to the historic environment. Archaeologists love systematically dismantling archaeological sites. That is to say that the data that comes out of an archaeological site is in many senses the leftovers, the only thing that survives from the archaeological process. And if that's true, then those digital objects are vitally important. They become the only testimony, the preservation by record of the archaeological community. Set up for the Archaeology Data Service, given the concepts that I've just described, tens of thousands of pounds. It was two and a half people on the server. And this funding was very hard to attract. Second repository I was there to be involved in the setup, Glasgow Museum's Resources Centre. Let's observe that the city of Glasgow is one of the poorer cities in Europe, and yet the city's museum collection is valued at billions of pounds. It is the second largest civic museum collection in Europe, and it's valued for commercial purposes or insurance purposes at more than the building stock of the city. So it's worth billions of pounds. And in the context of this relatively impoverished city, facing many challenges of unemployment and health and poor outcomes in a variety of different ways, it's relatively straightforward for the City Council to spend tens of millions of pounds on a new museum repository. Because those tens of millions of pounds are actually a relatively small investment set against the billions of pounds that the museum collection is worth. And moreover, by providing state-of-the-art storage, by providing accessible and useful facilities, we can turn the museum collection into an active ingredient in the city's economy. Instead of 2% of the museum collection being on display, 100% of the museum collection can be on display in theory, and 100% of it therefore adding to the economy of the city. The point is that Archaeology Data Service, very hard to say what the value of the data is, very hard to get the investment. Even though we understand, conceptually how unique that information is. In the second case study, we have a value, we know what that value is, and that value can be expressed clearly, and the investment can follow against that, even in economically underprivileged or economically austere times and places. Not a direct comparison, but I think I'm making my point here that we're much, much better at asserting the value of physical collections than we are about digital. We can also trace the economic impact, though, of providing access to data. And some work by Neil Beagray, also actually John Houghton at Victoria University, have looked at the costs and benefits of providing access to information from the Economic and Social Data Service, which is a UK-based social science, effectively, data centre, looking at the return on investment. And a fairly complex, fairly sophisticated return on investment analysis for the broader economic impact. And the conclusions they draw are striking, that for every pound spent on ESDS, there is a net economic value of £5.40. That is a very significant return on investment. That makes that, in terms of infrastructure, a really sound investment for the UK taxpayer. And one can increase in returns on investment in data and related infrastructure arising from the additional use that therefore is possible on the basis of that information expands even more. So there's a solid economic case to be made for the investment in data. But note again here, the economic benefit accrues outside of the agency which is actually undertaking the preservation. This idea of the triple bottom line is not simply a financial one. Let's think for a moment about the environmental impact of digital preservation. And let's look at that through the lens of a number of economic or environmental impact assessments around, in this case, UK higher education. So in 2009, a study shows that the UK higher education community spent £1.6 million on electricity costs per annum for data storage. That's the equivalent of £500,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So 500,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide just for data storage in 2009 from just the higher education sector in the UK. What does digital preservation offer to reduce that sort of tonnage of green footprint, that sort of tonnage of carbon dioxide? Well, again, let's observe that digital preservation is about managing the data sets that we want to manage for the long term. That's managed replication, and one might think that replication means more data sets, which means more storage. But on the contrary, managed replication means picking the things we want to replicate, deduplicating those things which we don't need multiple copies of, and having confidence in our deletion and disposal policies. It might seem strange to hear this from someone who works with the Digital Preservation Coalition, but let's observe that digital preservation is also about identifying, picking the winners, and being clear about the things that we no longer need to keep. A simple task of deduplicating our collections would reduce the energy costs associated with preserving or with retaining data sets. And if we can reduce the energy costs, we reduce the carbon footprint necessary to retain that data through time. So let me observe digital preservation as a friend and an ally to the reduction of our carbon footprint. The triple bottom line also encourages us to think about the social impact, and I promised I would return to this concept here. What's the problem in the long term? The problem isn't about data loss, the problem is about opportunities and the way in which the loss of data creates barriers to opportunities, creates barriers to the reuse of the data collections that we have. My point is that data loss is not the only problem, and it's perhaps not even the main problem. Why do we do digital preservation? Well, let's observe it's not for the sake of the bits. We're not doing digital preservation for the sake of the digits. We're doing it for some greater purpose. We do digital preservation for different reasons in different sectors. Typically in the public sector, we may think about safety, we may think about transparency, we may want to transfer information from one generation to the next, we might want to develop insights into efficient business processes, we might want to exploit intellectual property for the long term. We might need access to safety information over extended periods, extended life cycle, the life cycle of infrastructure, the life cycle of ourselves, of humans. But fundamentally, we do digital preservation for real world outcomes, and that's true in the public and in the private sector. In the private sector, the drivers might be to do with legal or regulatory compliance. It might be protecting ourselves from vexatious litigation. It may be about unanticipated exploitation. Perhaps we've just spotted the album that we can release from the recording artist who has just passed away. Whatever it might be, there are a range of different ways in which we can benefit from having better long-term access to digital information, whether in the public or in the private sector. Let's spell that out. We do digital preservation for healthier, wealthier, safer, smarter, greener, more transparent, more creative people, organisations, societies, communities, nations. Digital preservation is not simply about documents and bits and bytes. It's not simply about archives. It's not simply about legal compliance. It's about people and it's about opportunity. And if we want to know where to start in the context of digital preservation, don't start with the bits, start with the people, start with the opportunity. So, resolving this back down, digital preservation and the triple bottom line. There's no single way to make the case around digital preservation, and there are many different ways of doing it. We could do a risk or opportunity analysis. We have to understand what we have. We have to know, therefore, what we have to lose. Let me observe that advocacy, it's ongoing. You're going to have to commit yourself to making the case over and over and over again. It's not fundamentally, however, about data. It's about the opportunities that the data brings and how we can extend those opportunities from one generation to the next. I'm going to come to a conclusion in a moment, but I'm going to finish by just introducing briefly, if I may, if you'll indulge me, the Digital Preservation Coalition. Digital preservation does four things. We offer four strands, four strategies of our work. We offer a political, or work towards a political and institutional climate receptive to the need for digital preservation, communications and advocacy in other words. We offer tools for competent and responsive workforces, so a great deal of training work. We develop better tools, smarter processes and enhanced capacity. So we try to help people along and get useful research projects out to parties in a position to adopt them. And finally, we seek and try to promote closer and more productive collaboration between all of those people involved in digital preservation. I'll dip into each in turn. Communications and advocacy, a range of different tools and facilities around that advocacy work. Sometimes it's very, very specific individual conversations with senior policymakers, senior decision makers, civil servants, organisational executives. Sometimes it's high level stuff, trying to get press, trying to get media. Sometimes it's just pausing for a moment and allowing a little bit of internal advocacy. And let me point you to the Digital Preservation Business Case Toolkit, free, available online, which you can use to draw your own business case around digital preservation as you see fit. Let me briefly describe our work around competent and responsive workforces. Training, we do a lot of training. I've mentioned already the Digital Preservation Handbook. That sits alongside a couple of very active events, getting started in digital preservation, making progress in digital preservation. Both of those are training programs which we offer and we operate. We also, by the way, offer grants. So there's what we call the leadership program, which allows us to send people on difficult to obtain or difficult to access training opportunities in digital preservation. And we also engage increasingly with higher education, with the training sector. We have an annual student conference, and we're constantly looking at ways in which we can enhance the capacity of the workforce. I wanted to briefly mention better tools, smarter processes, enhanced capacity. So a small number of research projects here, for example, a project on JPEG 2000, another one on PDF. We've just published a report on preserving social media, the same on transactional data. Those two reports have come out in our Technology Watch report series, and let me recommend that to you, where we get an expert in the field to ascend the highest step ladders we can afford to give them with the strongest binoculars and scan the horizon and see what's coming towards us, and then package that information up back out to our members, but indeed to anyone who's interested in reading about it. A range of different research projects here and a range of opportunities to get involved. Finally, we have a job of work to do to introduce everyone to everyone else. Partnerships. We have a range of different working parties. I won't bore you with them. We have a range of webinars and a range of opportunities for our members to meet with each other and with others active in the field. So DPC, in some sense, most useful contribution to the world is in effect our database, our network, and making it possible for people in different types of agency to speak to each other. We're a membership organisation. The point of this logo fest is to remind you that it actually all derives from the member revenues. And those members are from many different types of organisation in many different sectors. There's no one particular sector for the DPC, all are welcome. And breaking news, we've just in 2016 opened the doors for international membership. So whereas previously we were dominated, not entirely run, but largely dominated by members from the UK and Ireland, so now we open the doors for members around the world, and indeed are in conversation with prospective members in Australia. So if you're interested in joining us, please do consider us as and an ally in your work. So I promised I would come back at the end, just briefly again to say hello to you all. Again, apologies, I won't be able to be with you. You've heard what I've had to say, but I would be really interested to hear what you have to say. So please do get in touch. Contact details as previously advertised. Very open to join in the conversation, perhaps to gather some thoughts together, and perhaps join you online for some sort of ongoing exchange. Very happy to do that. I'm very grateful to the organisers for letting me join you today, and I do hope that we can follow up this conversation in due course. Thank you very much.